Francis Fukuyama, thank you so much for taking the time to process what happened last night together.
Yeah, I'm very happy to. I spent the evening with my students watching the results as they came in. A lot of them are non-American, and so I had to do some explaining about how peculiar the American institution of a national election is. But it meant that I didn't get that much sleep, and it was, depressing, very depressing in the end.
I'm operating on about half an hour sleep in the last 48 hours, so hopefully everybody will be indulgent. If either of us is incoherent, it's more likely to be me than you. You did confess to me earlier that you'd also hosted a similar party in 2016. It seems like you haven't learned your lesson and you owe us all an apology.
Yeah, I think that I've got to stop doing this. I did have a bottle of rum, Venezuelan rum, that I was going to open up, if Kamala had won. And I had convinced myself, based on some of the things that my colleague Larry Diamond, our mutual friend Larry Diamond, had said to, make me optimistic. But it turned out that this was a complete raising of expectations that made the deflation even more painful. And the bottle of rum is still there.
Well, you're a good man for not indulging in a bottle of rum to try and process what happened. So, look, Donald Trump has been elected the 47th president of the United States. He's the second president since Grover Cleveland to be elected in 2 non-consecutive terms and take double real estate in the strange numbering of American presidents. He's the first Republican presidential candidate to win the popular vote in 20 years. He will likely have a trifecta of the government, having control of the House and the Senate. And of course, he also has a Supreme Court that is reasonably sympathetic, at least to his social and cultural program. What does all of that mean for America and for the world?
Well, I think that it has a much deeper significance than certainly a lot of Democrats were thinking. In 2016, he was elected to the surprise of everybody, and I think that many people, myself included, thought that this was kind of a fluke, that, he had not won the popular vote, and Hillary was a particularly bad candidate, and, there's a lot of reasons that Democrats could give themselves for why that happened. And there was also an expectation that once he became a one-term president and Biden was elected, that the world would kind of snap back to something like what it was before 2016. But now it's not just the fact that Trump succeeded in getting reelected. He didn't squeak his way in. He really won a pretty resounding victory. He defeated Kamala Harris in all of the swing states that were, up for grabs. They got the Senate. They're very likely, as you said, to get the House as well. They already control the Supreme Court. And so, conservative power is consolidated in a way that makes the Biden administration look like the fluke, that it was just the last gasp of a dying order. It reminds me a little bit of the 1980 election. I wasn't a particular fan of Ronald Reagan, but he changed the tenor of the time in ways that I didn't expect, at the moment of his election. So just to give you one example, I remember when I was a student, Adam Smith was not considered a serious writer, and very few, political theory people actually tried to study Adam Smith and read his books seriously. After Reagan was elected, all the academics actually, got on board with that, and Smith is a very serious writer, but it gave a legitimacy to, to market economics that really had not existed, or other things like when I was in college in the early 70s, if you said, I want to go to business school, most of my friends would look down on that person and say, you're just greedy and so forth. And then after his election, it was okay to go to business school. And in fact, people went to business school in droves. And so I think that there's going to be a change in the tone of a lot of American society that will go deeper than just whatever policies Trump tries to enact. But this time around, I'm not quite sure what the leading ideas that guide this are, other than kind of resentment at, the educated elites and this sort of thing. But that doesn't really define a positive set of ideas towards which we are moving. And so that's the kind of puzzlement I have right now.
So I made a somewhat similar argument in my post on Substack the morning after the election, which is that this is the beginning of the Trump era, which is a slightly question-begging title because, of course, in many ways we've been obsessed with Trump for 10 years. But I think until the day of the election, it was still possible to hope that Trump would enter the history books as a kind of strange footnote. There was this strange aberration of an election in 2016 in which sort of these various things went wrong. Suddenly you had this figure that really cleaved the political system for 10 years. But, he lost the midterms in 2018. He lost his bid for re-election in 2020. The Republican Party didn't do very well in 2022. And then, lo and behold, he managed to win the Republican primary again in 2024, but duty was punished by the voters, and that was the end of it. Instead, I think he has earned a much more lasting place in history books. Always difficult to make those predictions, but it certainly feels like that today. And he is going to dominate not just a brief moment, but a political era. I think when you think about what it does to the Republican Party, that has also quite clearly changed on Election Day. It was getting harder to imagine the Republican Party would simply revert to what it was before, but it was easy to see various paths that weren't exactly shaped by MAGA. If Trump had lost decisively, the party had floundered for a number of years in opposition, and then who knows who might have emerged in the 2028 presidential primaries. Now it is quite clear that Trump owns the party for another 4 years, and very likely that he'll be able to have major say in who becomes his successor in 2028. So that makes a huge difference as well. I'm wondering, Frank, for a moment about how we should reflect on this as political scientists. I mean, in 2016, one quite dominant interpretation of Trump's victory was that it was racial resentment which was driving it, that the voters for Trump really were these kind of whites who were resentful about the status that they had enjoyed in society and that was being undermined. There was an interpretation that this is kind of the last rebellion of the declining white majority, that it's kind of basically these old white men who are about to die and about to pass out of the electorate, but this is the last moment where they can arithmetically make their stand, and so we have to get push through this, and then they're going to be gone. And that's the kind of idea that Trump was, an instantiation of a tyranny of a minority, that he could only really win by not winning the Electoral College, by exploiting various ways in which non-white voters are supposedly excluded from the polls and so on. And all of this was comforting because all of this implied that, it's a last-ditch attempt, and after that, we're going to be done with it. It feels to me like those three frames have all been upended by this election and more broadly by some of the electoral trends of the last years. It is now clear that this is not just about white resentment, because Trump actually did very well among non-white voters, did very strongly in Florida, which has been a majority-minority state for a long time, particularly expanded his share of the vote among Latinos. It doesn't feel like the last stand of a dying electorate, since he actually has managed to diversify the Republican electorate in a broad way. And it doesn't seem like the tyranny of a minority, because for tyranny it may turn into, it would be the tyranny of a majority, since it looks like he's clearly on track, as we're recording this, to win the popular vote. So do political scientists have to really rethink the story of the last 10 years?
Yeah, definitely. I really never believed the racial resentment story because it never really corresponded to my observation of what Trump was. So I think that the way I interpret the kind of underlying zeitgeist. In my book on liberalism, I said that liberalism was damaged by two distortions. One was neoliberalism, so this worship of markets, Milton Friedman, that everything is just a matter of efficiency. And the other is what you might call woke liberalism, which is basically identity politics that you've written extensively about. And, both of those things, I think, played an important role in the Trump victory, the repudiation of both of those forms of liberalism. And in a strange way, the fact that Trump got so many black and Hispanic voters on his side was a return to class, or it was a case where class was trumping identity politics, because what the people that voted for him were basically working class blacks and working class Hispanics, and not educated ones. So the assumption that that a lot of people on the left made, that minority groups would be attracted to identity politics, I think that's been pretty decisively refuted. The one aspect that is still out there has to do with gender. And that was quite interesting in this election, because a lot of the support in those racial and ethnic minority groups was coming from men. And they were particularly, they didn't mind that much the anti-immigrant rhetoric. The racial part, I think, was not that important. I think the gender part was very prominent, and that's a broader cultural problem that I think has afflicted, a lot of less educated men of any race and ethnicity, in the country. So in my humble opinion, there's been this massive social change that hasn't really been talked about sufficiently. I think that as a result of the transition to an information economy, you've had this massive move of hundreds of millions of women into the labor force, over the last 40 years, which has completely changed the dynamics within families, where, especially with working class families, there are a lot of families that are supported primarily by the wife's income or the girlfriend's income. And that's led to this, real sense of anxiety. And you see this culturally as well. I wrote a piece for on my blog in Persuasion on the female hitman, and this is something that is a broader phenomenon. It's really interesting how completely dominated Hollywood is by images of strong women. In the case of hitmen, they're literally strong, right? They get into a fight with 6 big burly guys, and the woman destroys all 6 of them. And it's something that I think we don't appreciate, that this cultural change has taken place that then would make a lot of men very insecure, that women are always being celebrated in the culture, and not them. So what's the last movie you saw where there was a kind of working class white guy as the hero? So I think that the gender aspect of it became very important. Kamala Harris spent all of her time trying to mobilize women around abortion. I would say that that's an issue that most, especially young men, really don't care about, and I think that may have played some role in stoking this kind of resentment. So, in a way, I think gender has become more important than race, as one of the things that divides the country and around which polarization occurs. But I completely agree with you that this old interpretation about the centrality of race is just not right.
So I have 2 thoughts about that, right? Like, one is that on gender, there is a real way in which Democrats counted on, young black men, young Latino men, identifying by their quote-unquote victim status as non-white people. rather than as the kind of, let's say, suspect category of being male. But they would say, I'm going to vote for the candidate who promises to stand up for this intersectional coalition, and I trust that I'm going to be on the right side of that coalition by virtue of my skin color, when probably a lot of those men felt that a lot of the discourse, a lot of the culture is sending very negative messages about them on the basis of their maleness, and so they may not have seen themselves as natural parts of that coalition. I also wonder for how much of this is purely economic, right? If what we're seeing increasingly is that the Democratic Party is turning into the party of the highly educated, into the party of affluent parts of America, into the party of actual or aspiring members of a professional managerial class, into the party of the people who are upbeat about the future prospects. And if young women have much more reason to be optimistic because they're more likely to have completed a high school, college education, they're more likely to have skills that are adapted to the kind of jobs that are currently in demand. They may simply have seen themselves as part of the kind of, they may have seen themselves more in that part of a coalition. So perhaps it's not, the question is it gender in itself, or is gender a mediating variable here of a general kind of outlook towards success? And I guess my guess would be it's, a little bit of both, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And I have another question that is related, which is that, obviously there's been a big change historically in which political party African Americans support. So, after emancipation, it was obviously the Republican Party that was supported by African Americans, and went through a complicated historical process that culminated in the Civil Rights era. They changed their allegiance for very understandable reasons to the Democratic Party. Now, might we be living through a similar kind of substitution on the class front? Historically, it was, to a lesser extent, the working class that tended to vote for Democrats. The Democrats tended to be the party of those with lesser incomes, with less high level of skill, who wanted more redistribution. And now it's starting to look increasingly like the Democrats are the party of the highly educated, and Republicans are making these small, stumbling efforts to actually build a multiracial working class coalition. Do you think in retrospect we will think of this as just a sort of obvious class inversion that is comparable to the sort of inversion of which party African Americans support? Or do you think we're not going to get to anything nearly as extreme as that, and it's going to stay pretty muddled for the coming decades? Or perhaps it's a false start and Democrats go back to being the party of a working class, of a working man, of a small, of a person who's not fancy, in a way that perhaps would seem surprising right now.
Well, no, I think that transformation has happened, and it's happened in many other countries besides the United States. The Democrats just had a really hard time this election holding on to especially their male working class base and convincing them. The unions, the leadership of the unions was still mostly on the Democrat side, although some of them wavered until very late in the campaign. But you didn't see a kind of, really enthusiastic, union get out the vote campaign because, they knew that a lot of their rank and file had already defected to the Republicans. But, it's going on in Europe as well. I mean, a lot of the people, working class people that used to vote for communist parties in France and Italy are now voting for the populist parties, for Marine Le Pen or for Giorgia Meloni. And that substitution, has really weakened the traditional left in many ways, and it's then made the conservative parties take very different positions on economic issues. I mean, Europe was always different from the United States, but it's interesting how a lot of the MAGA Republican economic agenda has actually kind of dovetailed now with the agenda on the left in terms of wanting to control corporate America and reduce the power of American corporations to outsource jobs and to, exploit workers and that sort of thing. So I think that, we're in the midst of this transition. I guess the final thing I'd say is that, it's not just an economic issue. I mean, I think that your social class does determine a lot about how you vote, but a lot of that is cultural. It may be that we are at a point where we have a sufficiently prosperous society that the primary issue for a working class voter is not necessarily, do I have health care, do I have benefits, and the like. It's really, what kind of TV do I watch, or what kind of, cultural points of reference, are important to me. And you certainly saw, the Republicans trying to exploit that. What I used to think after 2016 is that culture had to be more important than economics, simply because if you really believe that the problem was out of work, unemployed, factory workers, they should be voting for the left-wing parties because they're the ones that want to redistribute income and protect jobs and so forth, but they weren't. And I think they actually saw, these cultural issues as more important to their working class identity, particularly migration and, the threat of their losing their jobs and so forth. And so that it's kind of redefinition of what it means to be working class, where it's much less in your overt political affiliation. It's more in your cultural preferences, and I expect that to continue. I wonder whether you're going to get a similar kind of reaction to Trump, because if you just play out in your mind his economic policies, they could lead to one of the biggest economic disasters that this country has ever experienced. He's talked about replacing the income tax with tariffs, and doesn't seem to have any concept of how economically damaging that's going to be. I suspect that the way this will play out is that the moment that he declares, a certain level of tariffs against German cars or, French wines or whatever, there's going to be this time around, there's going to be big retaliation. But more importantly, it's going to restoke inflation. So inflation is going to go back up to levels that we didn't even see during, the post-COVID period. And that's then, he's very attuned to not doing things that make him look bad. And so that means he's either going to have to, drop that particular issue, or, what I would can imagine seeing is that he'll fire the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, because you don't want the government reporting on the way that inflation and unemployment have gone up. But it could be that, it leads to a global recession that then deepens into a real, depression. And it will be a kind of overreaching that you really have to experience. I mean, the thing is that what I don't get is like these Silicon Valley oligarchs that kind of understand the way economies work, how they can stomach a guy that is promising, that kind of economic strategy. And I think first of all, I suspect they don't take it seriously. They don't think that Trump is actually going to carry through on any of this stuff. But maybe you have to actually go through a learning process where you try some of these radical ideas and they really lead to disaster, and then you begin to wake people up to the fact that this is not something that is generally going to, help any ordinary person. The only trouble is you got to go through 4 years of, this sort of thing before that learning process really kicks in.
Yeah, I think my fundamental model of American politics at the moment, and this election hasn't really changed that, is that both Democrats and Republicans are way out of the American cultural mainstream. They're both way off from where most voters are. And that means that Democrats are in danger of overreaching in ways that they get punished for, but so is Donald Trump and so are Republicans. And now that Trump is coming in with a lot of power and a big mandate, he is going to run the risk in purely electoral terms of falling into that trap. I think that's even true of one of his most popular issues. Immigration was clearly one of the things that most unambiguously helped Trump in the election campaign. But when you look at Americans' views of immigration, they're rather subtle. Americans value immigrants and value the things that immigrants have brought to America. Most of them believe not just that the present levels of ethnic diversity, which obviously much increased from the past, but further increasing ethnic diversity is a good thing. Only about 15% of Americans think that would be a bad thing. At the same time, Americans are, for understandable reasons, very, very keen to get control of the southern border and to make sure that the level of illegal immigration is drastically reduced. Now, I have a kind of background theory of public opinion on immigration, which is that what people want is no illegal immigration enforced with no state-sanctioned cruelty. And the problem, of course, is that that is impossible. And so when you have very lax policies and high levels of illegal immigration, people say, clamp down, we want to close the border. The moment you start doing the things you actually need to do to clamp down, they start to say, well, hang on a second, I didn't want this kid to die, I didn't want those kids to be separated from the parents, I didn't want this particular member of a community who's been there for 25 years and who seems like a very good and reasonable person to suddenly be taken out of a community and sent back to where they came from. And so I think even on that issue, which was a winning issue of Trump's and which he clearly has a popular mandate, which currently opinion polls clearly show that even the majority of Latinos want a significant level of deportation, he may quite quickly lose public support nevertheless.
Well, another problem with that enforcement policy was that the employers don't like it. I mean, they need that low-skilled labor, and they don't want to have to police, whether someone is in the country legally or not. But the thing is that the policy that Trump has been laying out in this election cycle is so much more extreme than what you just described. I mean, better border enforcement is something that I and many other Trump critics, would be very happy with. But, he's talking about rounding up 11 million people, putting them in camps, taking them out of their neighborhoods, and then sending them, I don't know, to Rwanda. I mean, that's what, that's what the British conservatives wanted to do. But, I mean, it's so far beyond any kind of reasonable expectation. Administratively, we simply don't have the capacity to do anything remotely on that scale. Morally, the idea that you'd go into a neighborhood and basically arrest people that had been in the country for 15, 20 years, whose children were all American citizens, and put them in a camp somewhere, it's just kind of mind-boggling. And again, I think that once you confront the reality of what it means to actually carry out the sort of thing that Trump claims he wants, people are going to wake up to the fact that this is a pretty extreme policy, and they don't actually, they wanted border enforcement, but they don't want concentration camps.
So I think we rarely disagree, but we may have an interesting small disagreement here. I've been thinking that despite my genuine admiration for Barack Obama, American history may have worked out much better if he had lost his bid for re-election in 2012 to Mitt Romney, who was, not just in retrospect, but probably at the time, a very decent and reasonable candidate with whom I had some disagreements, but who would have been a perfectly acceptable president. And of course, that would have led to there not being an open path for Donald Trump in 2016. And who knows whether he would have emerged in the same way in 2020. He may not have had the oxygen to become a big national figure through his opposition to Obama, through his claims that Obama's birth certificate was falsified and all of those kinds of things, if Romney had won in 2012. Now, one of the aspects of Romney's campaign in 2012 that was marked is that he was talking, a slightly controversial term, about self-deportation. But what he really meant was, we should have an employment verification system in which people really are responsible for making sure that the people they hire have legal status. And then the incentive for coming into the country would be much lower. And perhaps even some of the people who are undocumented who already are in the country might decide to go home to the countries of origin because they would have trouble making a living. Now, I sort of find it strange. There's like a couple of things where it's just like, whenever that's raised, Americans just sort of say, well, that's not possible, employers don't like it. In every other country that happens. I mean, when I was on on a term as a visiting fellow at Oxford University, I wasn't able to access my room until I proved that I was legally in the country. When I do any kind of work in another country, I need to first prove that I have legal entitlement to work in that country. I mean, that's something that works in many, many places. And if you're thinking about how to reduce incentives to come to a country illegally, it does seem to me like something like that would be a much more humane and workable solution than the alternative, certainly what Trump is proposing in terms of mass deportations. But even the Democrats are willing to go along with more and more militarized border security and so on.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we disagree on this. I just think that the opposition to a national ID card is actually pretty deep, and it's an aspect of American exceptionalism, a sort of pathological aspect of American exceptionalism. I've heard conservatives say a national ID card will allow the government to keep track of me and attack my freedom of speech because they can identify, if I say something critical, they're going to be able to go after me more easily. I think that people on the left also believe that it's a way of, keeping track of their favorite groups by a government that they basically don't trust. I know a lot of Europeans. There was one very senior official that I worked for back in the 1970s who was Swiss, and he said, "It's crazy. Why can't you have a national ID card? Every country in the world has one." And yet that's something that's just not gotten any traction, and it is absolutely necessary if you're actually going to control illegal immigration. If you don't know actually the status of somebody, back in the day, a large number of undocumented immigrants actually did not come across the border. They were visa overstayers. There were people that had come into the country legally with a visa, and then as a student or whatnot, then it expired, and they just stayed on. And without a national ID, there's no way of controlling, that kind of illegal immigration. So it's been it is a really strange thing, and I'm not sure that it would actually be so readily accepted as a solution to this problem, because it's something that has been tried, in the past, and it's met a lot of resistance.
And you're right that the Labour government in the United Kingdom tried to introduce a national ID card in the wake of 9/11, and there was very significant resistance to that there as well, which is another data point that seems to suggest you might be right about that. Let's get to the heart of the matter. How dangerous is Donald Trump going to be for America's democratic institutions over the course of the last 4 years? How should we think about assessing the extent of that danger?
Well, I think the primary threat is really to the rule of law, that he's been very clear in the last few months and weeks that he's really out for revenge. He wants to take revenge on all the people that he believes have been prosecuting him or persecuting him. And I think that this is where Schedule F really matters, because he couldn't get his own Justice Department, to go after Hillary Clinton, even though he wanted them to. But, he understands that that was a weakness of his first term, and I think he's going to put people in key positions in the Justice Department that will enable them to open up investigations. Let me just give you one concrete example. The head of the IRS is subject to what they call for-cause dismissal, meaning that he's got to commit some crime or some really overt, offense before you can fire him. And Schedule F is going to get rid of that. I mean, and there are hundreds of these for-cause positions throughout the government that occupy very important policy positions. So if Trump can fire the head of the IRS, put a loyalist in there, then you could open up a tax audit against a CEO, a journalist, head of an NGO, or the NGO itself, that will be incredibly, harassing and will tie the organization, the individual up in all sorts of legal fees. So, you're not talking about a Putin style putting everybody in a gulag, but you are giving the executive incredible power against individuals and against organizations. And I think that that'll be kind of one of the primary lines of attack of Trump against his enemies, and I think that they know what they're doing, and they're going to get the different pieces in place that will allow them to, really go after people. So I think it'll be like, the whole discussion about fascism I thought was a little bit misplaced, because that conjures up, pictures of concentration camps and sort of action on a scale that I don't think we're going to ever see. But in terms of replicating Viktor Orban's behavior in Hungary over the past, 15 years, I think that's extremely predictable, actually. And I think that that's what the Trump administration is going to look like, this kind of steady, slow erosion of one check and balance against, executive power after another.
So I've been thinking about this in the frame that you introduced in 2017 when you said that his first presidency would be a kind of natural experiment, quasi-natural experiment in which sort of a long-running debate in political science about whether democratic stability is provided by the strength of institutions or by the public spiritedness of elected politicians would be put to the test. I believe that this time around, the natural experiment is going to be a lot more extreme for two reasons. One, and you've referred to a number of these things, is that Trump is going to pose a much more significant danger than in 2016. He has much more executive experience than he did at that time. He has a much bigger set of loyalists who he's able to put, first of all, into about roughly 3,000 positions that new American presidents appoint in general, and secondly, potentially into those additional positions that he may liberate through Schedule F. Another important point is that he has much more control over the Republican Party than he did in 2016, when much of the congressional delegation not so secretly disliked or even hated him. Now, most new members of the House of Representatives are people who won their primaries by claiming to be Trumpier than their competitors, or sometimes claiming to be Trumpier than Trump himself. And of course, he, from day one, is much more aware of where the limits of his power are, how he wants to push against them, and how he wants to take revenge on his political enemies. So I think
he's
all
also
of that
angrier. He's really mad in a way that he wasn't in 2016.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Now, on the other hand, I guess you made the comparison to Orban, and I think that in terms of how to understand who Donald Trump is, that's absolutely right. I think we both agreed that we should think of him, roughly speaking, I know you would use the same term, as an authoritarian populist who's comparable to people like Viktor Orban in Hungary or like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, like Narendra Modi in India, rather than to try and compare him to past historical figures under the label of fascism. Now, when I look at some of these populist figures and look at where they've succeeded in capturing power and where they haven't, I wonder whether some of those basic attributes of a political system that political scientists had I think, excessive trust in the 1980s and 1990s as guaranteeing the stability of democracy, it does matter in a less deterministic way. So it seems to me that it is much easier to capture power in a small country with unified political power than a large country with a deeply federally distributed political power. It's much easier to do so in a relatively small economy in which most businesses and media enterprises are reliant on government spending, funding, and so on, than it is in a large, wealthy country in which enterprises are more independent, in which media companies like the New York Times have millions of subscribers that allow them to work somewhat independently of financial pressures put upon them by the federal government. It seems to me that it's easier in a country with a relatively recent democratic history, even if you've had some changes of government for free and fair elections, than in a country where those instincts do go back 100 years or more. And so, one of the things that Viktor Orban did was that there's a national electoral commission It has 9 members. I know that's the exactly right number in Hungary, but something like that. You appoint 5 members to it, and boom, you're in control, right? In the United States, you have 10,000 different bodies making electoral rules, which explains why we're often a mess, but which also makes it much, much harder to take those over. So, I guess my question is, yes, the stress test to these institutions is going to be much harder than it was in 2016, but aren't American institutions also likely to be more resilient than those of Hungary, for example? And if that's the case, if you have, as I put in a recent article, a kind of I'm blanking on what I call it. If you have a very, very strong force meeting a kind of immovable obstacle, how is this natural experiment 2.0 going to play out?
No, it's true. I think you do have to look at specific institutional rules. For example, I think that the strongest institution was actually the judiciary in Trump's first term. And the reason for that is that we have lifetime appointments of judges, and it's very difficult to change the federal judiciary. He did it in some cases, with retirements and deaths and so forth, but that's something that you can't do. Whereas I think in, I forget exactly which populist authoritarian countries, you basically could retire the entire court, within a year. They did that in El Salvador, for example. I mean, they just got rid of all of the judges, in one fell swoop. Bukele did. And you can't do that.
They did a version of that in Poland that wasn't entirely legal, but they used retirement mechanisms to try and place their loyalists on the court.
But it would be much harder to get away with something like that in the United States, and that's why I think, most of the judiciary didn't go along with the election denialism back in the 2020 election. So, yeah, I think you're right that things are stronger. But, there's also these other weird characteristics of our system right now. What do you make of Elon Musk, richest man in the world, that all of a sudden decides that he's going to become a political actor? One of the things that I have found really appalling about this election cycle is, a billionaire can just decide to spend hundreds of millions of dollars supporting one particular candidate. And, I think that's, in Europe, you just don't have that situation. I think there are individual European countries where you're not even allowed to advertise, on television during an election cycle, and it's kind of appalling that you can have these private actors that can amass the kind of power that they have, and then extend that power into politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think U.S. elections are basically a big conspiracy to subsidize local television stations. Given how much money campaigns spend on that kind of advertising. No, I agree with you, and it's going to be very interesting to see what role Elon Musk plays in the government, and I'm particularly intrigued to see whether Donald Trump has any genuine regard for RFK Jr., or whether RFK Jr. is the useful idiot who served him to make inroads among independent voters and build a slightly broader electoral coalition. And now that the electoral victory is in, Trump says, you're never going to go and run health in the United States. What are you on about? I hope in this particular case that Trump proves to be his usually unsentimental and ruthless self, because the idea of RFK Jr. being in charge of a very important health authority is pretty scary to me.
Let's hope. But Musk is a different kettle of fish, because he holds something extremely valuable, not just to a president, but to the country as a whole, which is why, among other things, you couldn't take away his security clearance for having had all these secret conversations with Vladimir Putin. He's just too valuable in what he does for other reasons. And so I think that kind of makes him a sort of unique threat.
So you mentioned Vladimir Putin, and we haven't really touched on the international dimension of all of this yet. It is relatively easy to imagine what kind of domestic policies Donald Trump will pursue, with how much discipline and how much effectiveness he's going to do that is an open question, but roughly speaking, it's clear where the direction goes. I think there's a few more question marks around his trade policy. I mean, how seriously is he really going to pursue a kind of trade war? Just how high is he going to raise tariffs? But I think there too, the general direction is clear. I have genuine trouble thinking through how he's going to act in international affairs. He's clearly impatient with the Ukraine war, impatient with the support that the United States is giving to Ukraine. But is he going to go and try and negotiate some kind of tough deal with Vladimir Putin where he's looking out for the interests of the United States? Or is he going to simply bargain Ukraine away for some other real or perceived benefit that he thinks might be in the interest of the US in a way that doesn't take Ukrainian interests into account at all? I find it hard to tell. In relation to China, he obviously is generally taking quite a tough stance. He seems to think of China as the genuine threat to the United States in the long run. At the same time, he said things about Taiwan that undermine confidence that he cares about protecting the island's current status at all. But is he going to give Beijing the signal that they can do whatever they want in Taiwan, or is he actually going to turn out to be quite tough on that because he thinks of China in general as a big rival to the United States? I find it really hard to foretell both what signals he's going to send, what actions he's going to take, and how other countries are going to read those signals. What's your best attempt at a projection here?
I think there's less uncertainty about Ukraine. A lot of the Republican Party really doesn't like Ukraine, and they think we're on the wrong side of that conflict, as evidenced in the 6-month cutoff of all weapons to Ukraine by the House Republicans. And so I think that Trump can probably get a short-term deal with Putin that will freeze the war, that he can come away from, saying, look, I promised to stop the war and I did it, but it will be deeply bad for Ukraine, because really if they don't have some kind of a NATO guarantee, any ceasefire is really going to just lead to their eventual national demise, because the Russians will simply start fighting again, the moment they feel that the balance is tipped or they've rebuilt their forces sufficiently. So I think that that's pretty clearly what he intends to do. I think that he also is probably not going to overtly try to pull out of NATO, but he doesn't have to. All he has to do is send signals that he's actually not going to carry through on an Article 5 guarantee, and that's enough to basically weaken the credibility of the alliance, which is really what NATO is all about. I think that one of the enduring characteristics of Trump in foreign policy is he does not want to use American military force, and he does not want to be a president that's going to get America involved in another war, in particular a war with China. And right now, Biden, I don't know whether Americans in general will actually be willing to go to war with China to protect Taiwan, including a lot of Democrats. But, Biden's been trying to do this dance where he suggests that, yes, we will be willing to do that, and that'll be enough to deter China. I think that a lot of foreign players can see that, Trump does not really want to get into a war, that he keeps talking about the danger of World War III, and that, he's not going to put us in a position to get into World War III. And I think that, in a way, this paper tiger dimension of him will be, increasingly apparent to people. So he'll talk tough about China, but, if he can pull off a deal with them, I think that he would do it at Taiwan's expense. So I think, that's the most likely course that he's going to follow. The other thing is that I suspect he will not raise any objections to anything that Benjamin Netanyahu wants to do in, the Middle East, and that's going to take away, whatever inhibitions were put on that. And that's actually something that Trump's got to be careful about, because we're much more likely to get directly involved if the fight between Israel and Iran, escalates into a full-scale war. So there, I don't really see exactly how Trump is going to deal with those competing, considerations.
George W. Bush came in as a president who was much more skeptical about using military force abroad, who wanted America to be less involved in the world in various ways, and that's not how things turned out, right? So there's a real question about how presidents who intend to be less involved on the world stage can end up getting drawn into conflicts through happenstance, through tragic circumstances in the case of 9/11 and then subsequently bad decision-making, or through sort of strategic blunders of their own. On foreign policy, I think there's sort of two ways of thinking about the risk that Trump poses. One is that it is likely to have clearly predictable bad effects, right? It is likely to weaken NATO in such a way that Russia is further emboldened in Europe or something like that. The other is a kind of tail-end risk, right? Where the problem is that Trump is so unpredictable that perhaps 90% of the time you run the second presidency and things somehow turn out to be fine, perhaps in part because there is something to the madman theory of foreign relations where other countries are going to be wary of trying the United States because they generally don't know how Trump might react. But, 10% of the time it goes really, really, really badly wrong. Do you think that the danger we're dealing with is both of those? Is it more the former? Is it more the latter?
I think that, people have suggested that his unpredictability might actually be an asset, the way Richard Nixon deliberately used unpredictability as a way of, getting to a settlement in the Vietnam War. I don't think it works that way with Trump, because Nixon actually had the credibility that he was willing to escalate, and he did escalate, in the last few years before the collapse of South Vietnam, bombing targets and so forth. The risk of the uncertainty about Trump is whether he will actually do anything. And you could see people actually being tempted by a belief that he is so averse to using military force that, they can actually get away with stuff. And I have not seen him in his first term do things that, like Nixon, that would actually involve real risk. And certainly he has not made any effort to build up the U.S. military in a way that would allow him to actually make use of it. I actually think that we're in a pretty serious situation that is very different from the one that any previous president, has faced, because you now have this very overt alliance between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. They're providing mutual military support backed by, pretty formal understandings of their desire to cooperate with one another. And, the risk of some major incursion or use of force on the part of any of these actors, I think, is much, much bigger than anything that George Bush faced, when he came into office. In fact, they kind of manufactured a threat that didn't really exist, and he didn't actually have to deal with the kinds of aggressive risks that I think any president today is going to face, and that does require the ability to actually use force. And unless you can convince people that you're willing to do that, I don't think that we're going to have that much deterrent power. I thought for some time that the single thing that has weakened us militarily is actually our internal polarization and this uncertainty whether we would actually be willing to use the capabilities we clearly possess. And Trump has been at the core of that uncertainty. So I don't think that unpredictability is going to be a useful asset that will scare people. It may actually be a liability that will tempt foreign, powers to try to test us in ways that, perhaps didn't exist with previous presidents.
It feels to me, in retrospect, to put it perhaps a little counterintuitively, that Trump's election in 2016 was a big gift to Europe, at least a big opportunity for Europe, because it was a warning sign of things to come. Europe could have reacted to his victory in 2016 by recognizing that it can no longer rely on the United States as a reliable strategic partner in the way that it did for most of the post-war period. And that might have put Europe in a position, for example, to help Ukraine in a much more substantive way on its own, even in the absence of the United States, if the continent had taken decisive action over the course of the last 8 years. Of course, if 2016 was, again, slightly churlishly put, a gift to Europe, Europe wasted it. It effectively, I think, waited for the nightmare to pass, thinking that this must turn out to be an aberration of history, that some decent Democrat would come back and reestablish friendly transatlantic relations. And of course, Joe Biden's victory in 2020, Biden perhaps will turn out to be the last genuine transatlanticist to be a president of the United States by formation and by instinct, provided exactly that. And so Europe went back asleep. Well, now Europe is in the same dilemma it was in 2016, except that the geopolitical situation has become a lot more scary on the European continent with the Ukraine war, but also more broadly because of the deeper alliance between authoritarian actors that you just pointed to. What should European countries do, and what should other democracies do? What should Japan and South Korea and other countries around the world do to try and protect themselves against what's most concerning in this moment?
Well, I think the obvious answer to that is they have to invest more in defense. We are not ready for anything like a long war. I mean, our equipment has done very well technologically in the Ukraine war, but we don't have enough. We simply don't have enough stockpiles of missiles, of anti-tank weapons, of aircraft, all sorts of things. And we don't have the industrial base to ramp up production if we actually do get into a conflict. So anything other than a short, 2-3 day encounter with China or Russia is going to severely strain our capabilities. And with the Europeans, it's even worse because they've not been investing in the factories that would actually make the ammunition and the missiles and whatnot, to be really competitive. We've been kind of hoping that technology by itself would be sufficient to close that material gap, but in the end, I think as Ukraine is proving, technology can slow things down with an enemy like Russia, but ultimately it's the mass and bulk and manpower that's going to be really, decisive. So we just need to spend more money on defense, across the board.
What should those who are worried about Donald Trump and what should broadly the Democratic Party do in the next years? I have to say that I'm a little bit concerned that Democrats will basically rerun the script of 2016 to 2020, that they will bring out the hashtag resistance again, that they will cast not just Donald Trump as a dangerous politician, but all of his supporters as terrible people, that they will fail to introspect about the reasons why they have not been able to build a much broader electoral coalition. All of that might suffice for a few years. For the reasons you outlined earlier, Trump might very well overstep, and perhaps that's enough for Democrats to win back the House in 2026, perhaps even to win back the Senate, for that might be a harder win. It's not clear to me that it is at all enough to put a lasting end to the Trump era, which has dawned, yesterday as we're recording this. So, what does the broader ecosystem of people who are concerned in a serious way about Trump's ability to potentially dominate, a significant period, a significant epoch of American politics do to resist him more effectively than we have done over the last 8 years?
Well, part of it, is what Kamala Harris should have done during her brief campaign, and it actually should have started under Biden. The two big issues really that drove people away from the Democratic Party were the border and identity politics. And especially with the identity politics, that's something that didn't cost any money. You had the Sister Souljah moment where you say definitely that I'm not in favor of, gender transitions, just at the say-so of a 12-year-old, adolescent, and make the case about why that's wrong and dangerous, and then actually admit that it was a big mistake for Biden not to have tightened control over the border, and having done it at the last minute, meant that nobody believed that he was serious about that, and just say openly, yeah, that was a mistake, and we're not going to make that mistake again if we come back into power. So that would be at least a start.
I haven't even simpler and cleaner Sister Souljah moment that I suggested Kamala Harris take at the time, but I still regret she didn't, which is that when her candidacy was very quickly elevated, it became clear within 24 hours that she would in fact be the Democratic Party nominee without a real primary process, and all of her supporters started organizing, following the instincts and the practices in their political professional milieu by race and gender, culminating in the call for white dudes for Kamala, which I sat through, and it was a little bit more self-ironic and a little bit less grating than I imagined it to be. But what a wonderful opportunity this would have been for Kamala Harris to go out and say, I'm so excited that there's so much support for me. Thank you, everybody who's organizing. I really would rather that my followers do not organize themselves by race and gender. Let's have calls where everybody does this together. What a nice way, without alienating anybody in particular, without calling anybody out in a hostile way, to demonstrate this is not the kind of candidate I want to be.
No, absolutely. I agree completely. And like I said, border enforcement actually is serious policy that takes investment and so forth. But, this kind of break with kind of foolish identity politics is really costless. It's just making a statement. And it's too bad that she didn't do that, because it really has driven a lot of the opposition. One thing that's pretty clear is that Trump's favorability ratings still are pretty low, and they were, below Harris's just as a individual. And so I think a lot of the vote for Trump was actually a vote against the Democrats, and the fact that they hadn't made these kinds of decisive breaks against things that people don't like about the Democratic Party. One other thing I think that could be done is this area that I've been focusing on a lot in the last few years, which is building things. Because, one of the things that the left in the United States is famous for is believing that you get legitimacy by adding procedures and regulations that get in the way of actually accomplishing anything. It takes us almost 10 years to get the permitting done for transmission lines, to get electricity, alternative electricity from Texas and Oklahoma to California. And if you want to solve the housing crisis, especially here in California, you just got to cut through all of the ridiculous red tape that exists before you can do anything, the way Josh Shapiro did in Pennsylvania when he rebuilt, I-95 after it had that big accident a year or so ago. And if a Democrat stood up and said, we have way too many environmental regulations, we really need, in the interest of environment, we need to cut through all this nonsense and really get things done and go back to building things again, I think that would also be a very positive message, but it was a route not taken, in this campaign.
Frank, thank you very much for leaving us on a constructive note. I think we're going to have to reassemble over the coming months to assess how things shape up and whether some of our biggest fears materialize, or whether hopefully they somehow turn out to be overstated.
Okay, well, let's hope. Yeah, it's been a good partnership so far, Yascha, so I look forward to continuing.